When I say Bond, you might think of Connery, Moore, or if you're the same age as me, even Craig. But I doubt you think of this guy.
Why this? In my business, you prepare for the unexpected.
This private vendetta of yours could easily compromise Her Majesty's government.
Then you have my resignation, sir.
Effective immediately. Your license to kill is revoked.
The truth.
I am telling the truth.
Problem, sir. Problem eliminated.
Who are you?
Bond, James Bond.
Clocking in with only 2 Bond films, The Living Daylights and License to Kill, Timothy Dalton's Bond and his films were way ahead of their time, and frankly, are some of the most overlooked and best Bond movies to date. But why do I think this? Firstly, we've got to go back in time and look at the landscape of Bond before Dalton got the part.
The qualifications for playing Bond.
Who will play the new James Bond?
Time to clean the slate and start again.
Meet the new Bond.
So we will avoid things like shake and not stir.
I just hope that my inexperience won't show.
The year is 1967. Connery has just left Bond after finishing You Only Live Twice. Albert Broccoli, producer of the Bond films, offers a young thespian actor the role of 007 for On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Timothy Dalton. But he turns it down as he believes Bond should be played by an older man.
I think Bond should be between about 35 and 40. And as a 25, 26-year-old, you know, it would not have been right.
Lazenby gets the role for one movie. Everyone unfairly hates it.
This never happened to the other fellow.
Connery comes back for one more, and then Moore takes the helm for over a decade. Under Moore, Bond slowly moves away from the classic style of Connery to more and more ridiculous and camp movies about a gentleman playboy rather than a ruthless assassin. They're fun.
My God, what's Bond doing?
I think he's attempting re-entry, sir.
But as the series goes along, they begin to become parodies of themselves, and with Moore getting older and a significant increase in stunt doubles because of it, it becomes harder to suspend your disbelief that a man close to his 60s is still James Bond. Once A View to a Kill is released in 1985, it gets horrible reviews, and Moore's tenure as 007 comes to an end. It does have a banging song though. It's safe to say that Bond has strayed far away from Connery's ultra-masculine hero.
Shocking.
After over a decade of camp Bond, there was only one way to save the Bond franchise: go back to its roots. They needed a revamp. Writers wanted to move away from the lighter side of Bond, whilst actively searching for a new actor to take the role.
We weren't quite sure exactly how to go with the part, so we sort of wrote it fairly middle of the road. We didn't make it as comic as it had been with Roger.
They find a young and upcoming Kiwi actor to play the role, Sam Neill, pre-Jurassic Park. He has a screen test and everyone is happy with him, apart from one person, Broccoli. He wants Dalton again. After some complexities, where the press and producers want Brosnan for the role, Dalton gets the part, and he wants to make some changes. He wants to go back to what Fleming believed Bond to be.
A year-long search to find the new Agent 007 finally came to an end in Hollywood this week.
The first question you ask a producer is, what do you want of me? Do you want me to carry on in the vein that's been set? Or do you want to set off on a new course? The safe, the easy answer is to say, stick with it as it is. In which case, I guess I'd have said no. Roger was brilliant at what he did, but I couldn't simply copy what he'd done. The movies have become somewhat pastiche. Before you go too long, you've become a parody of yourself. You've lost depth, you've lost texture, you've lost contradictions. You start to get shallow. What makes these movies work? What is it that got them going? You've got to go back to the beginning. Here was a hero who murdered in cold blood. Bam, 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 bam. The dirtiest, toughest, meanest, nastiest, brutalist hero we'd ever seen. This is what started those movies.
Shocking.
I wanted to bring people back to believing in this character, to bring my reality to it. I guess I've always liked a challenge.
After years of flamboyant, comically leaning Bond, Dalton took the character back to the books, finding most of his inspiration from the source material. Fleming's Bond isn't a wisecracking, blonde player who never felt a sense of danger when fighting his foes. He's quiet, aloof, and there to complete a job, usually an assassination of some sorts. If Connery was pure rugged masculinity and Moore was a playful comic, Dalton was a gentleman with a killer instinct. He has a certain coldness in his eyes that make you believe he's an assassin. English novelist Kingsley Amis noted that Fleming's hero shared the romantic melancholy of the Byronic hero. A Byronic hero is a variant of the romantic hero, known for their intelligence, cynicism, and self-awareness. They are usually emotionally or intellectually tortured, and often defy authority and rebel. Classic examples of this are Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights, and Rochester in Jane Eyre. Two roles Dalton had been praised for before Bond, and characteristics he brought to the character. Under Dalton, Bond became more cynical, pragmatic, and intense. We can see this in the opening of The Living Daylights. When Bond disobeys an order to shoot a female sniper, he expresses distaste for his profession.
Go ahead, tell him what you want. If he fires me, I'll thank him for it.
This is what Bond was to Dalton and Fleming, stripped back from the outlandish. The plot likewise emulates this, swapping out eccentric Bond villains for a complex arms-dealing conspiracy rooted in Reaganism. The third act sees Bond travel to Afghanistan and fight with the Mujahideen against the Soviet occupiers, which engaged with the Cold War geopolitics at the time, something the Bond series rarely does. Dalton's world emulates what Fleming wanted. It's dark. Bond is a troubled assassin. His villains aren't all trying to control or destroy the world, they're grounded. They are drug lords or arms dealers. They are not camp, they are cruel. Much like Bond is.
You keep it, old buddy.
And if this sounds pretty standard for Bond nowadays, you got to remember that this is what would happen after a kill in a Moore film.
Play it again, son.
And then they changed it to this.
Are you alright?
Switch the bloody machine off!
Pretty jarring. Quite the tonal shift. In the novels, Bond isn't nearly as much of a womanizer as the films make him out to be. He's fairly gentle and monogamous, which Dalton's Bond also follows, with his films only having one Bond girl in each, and him showing genuine affection to them.
All my life I've dreamed of this.
Well, maybe you'll play here one day.
It's too much to hope for.
He even fits Fleming's visual description of the character. But this isn't just my opinion. Wonder whose self-proclaimed Bond fanboy Christopher Nolan's favourite Bond is.
What's your favourite Bond actor?
My favourite Bond actor is Timothy Dalton. He's fantastic. And even License to Kill, which is aging better than I expected in some ways, but I think he's closest to the character in the book. And it would have been interesting to see him do more. Yeah, critics hated that Bond was monogamous, that he wasn't always quipping after murdering someone, and that he became grounded and reluctant.
And I guess the question that people would like an answer to is, what kind of a James Bond does he make? Well, I give him a mixed review. Timothy Dalton is a good actor. He is very convincing in the movie's more serious moments. He has a great screen presence. He looks interesting. But if he has a weakness, it's the comic side of the character.
All of these critiques turned into praises for another Bond down the line.
Em really doesn't mind you earning a little money on the side, Dryden. She'd just prefer it if it wasn't selling secrets.
Having watched Dalton's Bond after growing up on Craig's, the first thing I thought as soon as he came on screen was, that's Craig's Bond. Or Craig is Dalton's Bond. Everything Dalton was criticised for, Craig was praised for.
I give Daniel Craig a big thumbs up. Yeah. I think he's great as Bond. I think you made a lot of good points about him. I think he's the grittiest Bond, the most athletic, probably the closest to Ian Fleming's original vision.
Craig's films were praised for their gritty, violent nature and how they grounded the Bond franchise after a weaker entry, something that Dalton's had already done nearly 20 years beforehand, and something he paved the way for. especially with License to Kill.
License to Kill, the 16th 007 adventure, is not the usual Bond dose of escapism.
Make a sound, and you're dead.
Instead, a tale of the nasty times we live in.
Timothy wanted to get the job done. He was a man on a mission. It was the most violent Bond picture to date. Pushing the envelope all over the place.
This is terrible. I can't bring my 6- and 7-year-olds to see Bond anymore. Well, it was never made for 6- and 7-year-olds.
Well, not meant for schoolboys.
The further out on a limb you go, the more exciting it is.
It was tightly wound. It was no joke.
In Dalton's second outing, Bond expands on his reluctancy for his job and resigns from MI6.
Then you have my resignation, sir.
We're not a country club, 007.
He goes rogue after a South American drug cartel murder his friend and his wife. The writers set themselves a task of stripping Bond back even further.
One of our objectives was to create this realistic style.
It was kind of along the lines of the Yojimbo film. You remember the Kurosawa film? The samurai goes into town and without really attacking the villain and all of his cohorts, by just sowing the seeds of distrust, he manages to have the villain bring himself down.
I got the guy who set me up.
Only one guy.
What do you mean?
To say that this film and Bond are merciless is an understatement. He's borderline psychotic in it.
Now, Bond isn't exactly a good guy. You know, Bond's a killer. He often has to be as bad as the bad guys, but he has got a sense of justice.
And his rivals are quite the same. Sanchez, Bond's adversary in this outing, is a grounded, horrifying drug lord, very different to previous Bond villains, and critics hated it.
Yes, I'm not sure that I was happy that the villain this time is a quasi-realistic South American drug kingpin. I liked it better when we had the Goldfingers, you know, who were going to take over the entire world.
This was just another way in which these films were ahead of their time, as characters like Le Chiffre and Silver are hailed as great Bond villains, even though they're only arms dealers and rogue agents. Craig's Bond is also known for some of the most impressive stunts in the franchise, and similar to Dalton, he did all of his own stunts. But Dalton really had to up his stunt game, as the films were having to compete with the likes of Stallone's and Schwarzenegger's action classics.
I know that an audience want to share those moments of danger and excitement with Bond. We've got to make them. You all, us all, we've all got to share those moments, and so Bond's got to be in them.
This can be seen in The Living Daylights, where Bond fights the Heavy hanging out a Hercules 30,000 feet in the air. Or in License to Kill, where Bond catches a plane mid-flight to then tow. Nolan pays homage to this in The Dark Knight Rises with the opening sequence. He is his favourite Bond after all. Dalton is a big fan of Craig's Bond, saying that there is a case to be made that he's the best Bond ever. And he admits he's envious of his material, stating, "The first 25 minutes of Casino Royale, I would have died to have done that." Dalton was right Bond, wrong time. He had the press against him from the get-go. People hated Bond having a darkness to him, and his third Bond picture spent 5 years in a lawsuit, leaving him with only 2 films in the franchise. The Daltons came out in peak Cold War tensions. Audiences anchored more towards Schwarzenegger's action escapism than the new dark interpretation of Bond. They did eventually understand the colder Bond when Casino Royale came out, especially with the added post-9/11 anxieties. Dalton has gained more popularity within the Bond fanbase as time has gone on. In 1958, Bond author Ian Fleming sent a memo to the screenwriters of the first James Bond motion picture, in which he described Bond as a blunt instrument wielded by government department. Audiences will tend to dislike him until they get to know him, and then they will appreciate that he's their idea of an efficient agent, almost poetically describing Dalton's tenure as Bond. I would like to say that I do really like Moore's Bond, and it does sound at the start of the video that I just kind of hate his performance, and I think some of his earlier Bonds are some of the best in the franchise. But once again, Dalton was way ahead of his time. In the words of Martin McFly,
I guess you guys aren't ready for that yet. But your kids are gonna love it.
if you've made it this far, this is what I do between jobs. Consider subscribing, it really helps me out. And thank you very much for watching.
I'm sure the store's security footage will absolve me. Do feel free to spool through.